making the world, I think we're going to be in trouble. And it is all the more the case, since in the end, democracy is about individual agency, and individual agency understood as expressing as well as bring about social cooperation at the national and international level. In the end, politics, the world is about people, so unless we factor them in, it's not going to work. And I think that the overall goal is to move beyond material poverty, but also beyond spiritual poverty. We always focus on the material, but I think one of the problems of the modern world, of the modern culture, is not simply disparities among people, material poverty, but also, perhaps, I think, spiritual poverty. So how do we go about these things? And I don't know if you, I like them, I like the show. I don't know if you watch Games of Thrones. I think it's fantastic. And as you may know, maybe, I don't know, it's on Sunday night, 9 o'clock. So, I don't have any shares in the enterprise, but so I'm not getting any money out of marketing the program, but I mean, as you may know, the major threat in the Games of Thrones is winter is coming, right? So, in a way, what I have said earlier is all about, the looming and possibly unfolding crisis. That is to say, in the terms of Games of Thrones, winter could be coming. Winter is coming. So what do we do about this? So I think that there are two possible paradigms that we could embrace to prepare for the future. In fact, we should embrace the two of them, but in a combined fashion. Okay? And once again, I'm just using popular culture as a way to think in a more fun fashion about the future. So one paradigm is what I call the Reagan paradigm. So I came across this quote when I was working for Butchos. So, and I think it's interesting. So in essence, in our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much it unites all the members of humanity. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. Reagan had a wonderful speechwriter. I think her name was Peggy Nooney, and she was, and of course, she's a person who has written this sentence in a famous speech that he delivered in the 80s. So, I mean, one way to think about, people coming together is to really think about, how we would come together. Should we be facing an alien friend coming from outside this world? So, looking outward. So that's one paradigm possible. And the other one is what I call the Master Shifu paradigm. I don't know if you know this cartoon. It's called Kung Fu Panda. Yeah. I think it's the one. And this is Master Shifu, and this is Kung Fu Panda, and it's all about anything is possible if you have inner peace. So while Reagan invites us to focus on the outside, Master Shifu, who made out of his panda, a master kung fu. So he must have, delivered some truth. Tells us that the way for us is, and the way for the world is inner peace. So, which leads me to my final conclusion. In order to achieve peace and democracy, we should have one eye on the stars to see whether or not Martians are coming, and one eye looking within. So that's it. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Jeff.
Yes, I'm really intrigued, and I've often thought about these institutional problems. It kind of dawned on me that, in the world today there's several thousand languages, but there's only 193 nations that are represented in the UN. And by the way, all of those thousands of languages represent distinct peoples, which often see themselves as nations, not necessarily sub-nations, but nations in themselves. So there's a big disconnect there and a lack of representation. And that's why I'm intrigued. I have to look up Thomas Frank, because I'm unfamiliar with this notion of a UN People Assembly. So I'm going to look up this myself, but I'm curious, how does Frank define a people? Who is a people?
No. Basically, the idea is to really move away from having people being represented by government, and then having these governments hijacking, if you will, the voice of people, right? So that's his goal. And I think that what he envisions is the possibility for having a direct election of candidates who would be then not simply government appointee, as it is the case today, but simply people appointee. So then how do you go about creating an electorate and mechanisms for this election to take place? That's another story.
But they would still be like elected through the states. They wouldn't be representatives of the government, but they would still.
Well, no, it's actually he comes up with a number of scenarios, and it wouldn't have to happen necessarily at the national or regional level. So, but the question, how do you foster the emergence of a viable and credible candidate? How do you make sure that these candidates are not themselves self-serving, self-appointed candidates? I mean, all kinds of problems. And it's partly because, in fact, these problems were encountered first at the national level with the emergence of democracy at the domestic level, that the notion of representation was invented as a way to address and solve, by creating a bridge, this problem of direct democracy. So,
it sounded like before you're a supporter of sanctions when you said that the UN should.
No. I'm saying that it's difficult. For instance, it's difficult to think that an obligation has legal reality, and therefore is truly legal, if it is not accompanied and dovetail with sanctions if obligation is not pursued. For instance, you see, in a given country, when a crime is committed, in a way, what is owed to people, to the victim, is such that it is the obligation, the legal, normative, political obligation of the state, of the police, of the justice system to pursue, arrest, and trial the criminal, right? And that's what we call, a legal obligation, because there is not only the obligation to do something, but if the institution in charge of this obligation doesn't do it, it lacks legitimacy, credibility, and so on and so on. So at international level, this doesn't exist. We have these treaties in terms of social, economic, cultural rights, which are in fact expressing wishes and normative commitment, but of course nobody cares, and there is no obligation to fulfill them, and no sanctions if they are not in fact fulfilled by the institutions underwriting them. So that's why I talk about legal obligation 0, moral obligation no more.
So you're not for sanctions then, or?
No. I'm saying that, you see, one way to test the reality of an obligation as a legal obligation is whether or not this obligation truly triggers action, and if it doesn't truly trigger action, what happens to the institution not taking action, right? Well, and we all know what happens at the national level. If once again a crime is committed, it is the duty of the state, of the justice system, to try to do something to catch the criminal and prosecute and so on. And if it is not the case, then the justice system is viewed as having no credibility, no effectiveness, legitimacy, and so on. At the international level, and all this is based on norms, right? At the international level, you have these norms, but in fact there is no imperative of delivery, if you will. And that's what leads me to say that in fact we're not talking about legal obligation here as enshrined in these treaties. We're at best talking about moral obligation. And of course that's not good enough, because if people are given the choice to do the right thing or not, very often being weak and busy doing other things, they will not do the right thing. So people have to be in a way institutionally forced to do the right thing, and this is not the case at the international level. Hence the fact that we have to view these treaties at best as creating as well as expressing moral obligation, but never legal obligation. And the Convention of Genocide is an example of this. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So my first comment is about your ending.
You don't like Master Shifu?
Yes.
I like him very much.
But I've been watching.
Let's have him on the screen.
I've been watching Degrassi's Cosmos, and so I don't know if anybody's been watching that, but we are stardust. His major point is the same materials that exist in space and in stars exist in us in our brains and in our bodies. So I think this might be accomplishable, seeing as how we are made of the same materials as that of out of space. But
and notice that he's standing on a very, very thin stick. Perfect
Yes.
equilibrium.
with perfect balance.
Yes, perfect balance.
Wax on, wax on.
Yes, and the panda is in awe. He's really just stunned.
My question to you is, we observed such great success post Cold War in the spread of and the convergence of concepts and approaches toward moving toward a common logic globally in dealing with an economic system, global economic system, and one that seems to have been adopted by almost every nation and state around the world, whether or not their states see the kind of development consistent alongside nations equally. Do you think it's possible that the same kind of logic and value system that was espoused by an economic system such as market globalization could be observed with one such as democracy and
but you are
global democracies?
You're assuming that that globalization is fully positive.
No, but I am assuming, which may be an assumption too far, that each state has agreed to this logic and has adopted it.
I don't think so. I think it's very few states who have agreed to this logic. Most of them haven't been asked. They have to get along, or they have to go along. I don't think that there was a formal, explicit mechanism through which people had to sign on or not to for globalization. I don't think so. I don't know. What do you think? Norman, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm just
Okay.
I think that there is an evident system of logic. Whether or not states have explicitly signed on, they are complicit in participation in this global system that reflects a
Yeah, but I mean, to what extent are you complicit when you have no choice?
Yes.
I mean, complicit is a tough word. Is a tough word. I mean, are you truly complicit if you don't have a choice?
Could that logic, do you think, be expanded to some kind of value system such as democracy?
So which logic? Which logic?
Excuse me?
Which logic?
The kind of logic that was observed in a global economic system that more or less seems to have been successfully permeated among all
Yeah, but
states.
I mean, I don't think that it is the case that this economic logic was the product of a deliberation and thoughtful conversation between actors on an equal level. I mean, globalization was partly pushed from the West.
Is that why democratization seems so slow going, because it is perceived to be pushed from the West?
No, I think that so after working for Rutgers, I spent time in Asia, and that was for me an eye-opening experience, because when I was working for Rutgers and having been trained in the West, I had been taught intellectually and professionally to think that the Western discourse on global issues was global and universal. And once I was in Asia, in Japan and China, I was told again and again, once people were comfortable enough to tell me what they felt about what I was saying, that all what you're saying is very cute, but none of this is true. At best, what you are saying is a form of global provincialism. So and that's what I'm saying when I'm talking about the need to think about ways through which we would go beyond the West in our conception of the global. Because if we never go beyond the West out of our when it comes to our conception of the global, we're going to be in trouble. I mean, we and the other side. Okay, And so that's one thing. The other thing is, how do we identify in the non-West commitments to cosmopolitanism? Because the non-West is not simply, you know, we tend to think in the West that the non-West is not committed to democracy, but it's not or democratic values. That's not the case. So we just have to think about all these things. And of course, this process should be happening at different levels and should be part of a collective brainstorming, if you will, and not simply the product of one global region, the West, pushing towards others an agenda and forcing them to be at the receiving end of history, which in the process generate resentment and tension and conflict. So how do we have a global conversation on these matters so that we can formulate, that is to say, conceptualize and then implement policies which are, mindful of the true global nature of the world beyond the Western vision of the globe. I don't know. Once again, I'm just putting questions on the table. I don't have the answers. It's for the next generation, you, to do it. Norman.
Following what you said, talk to us a bit about Boutros Ghali.
Mm-hmm.
How does he come out of Egypt, out of that context, and have the positive attitude towards what I guess we would call more Western or global democratic ideals? And is there a lesson in there for what you've been talking about here in terms of his commitment? Is that a way to answer part of the question that was being asked here?
Well, I think there are three possible answers to this. First of all, himself was a member of a minority in Egypt, because Boutros was not a Muslim, he's not a Muslim, he's a Christian Copt. So, and as a Christian Copt, therefore as a minority person in a country mainly Muslim, he knew the value of having the minority rights being respected, and the respect of minority rights are part of the democratic paradigm, not only of this paradigm, but they are part of it. That's one thing. On the other hand, he was also a very elite and very elitist person, coming from a very, very aristocratic background. His grandfather had been either prime minister or the advisor of the prime minister in Egypt, so had also a very ambiguous relationship to the power of the people. And so that's the second element. And thirdly, while being an elite coming from Egypt, he still belonged to the third world, and therefore he was also instrumental he was a member of these generations of international lawyers. Abi Saab, who was for many years teaching international law in Geneva, Mohamed Bejawi, who for a long time was the president of the International Court of Justice from Algeria. Abi Saab was from Lebanon. So he was also of this generation of international lawyers who are now in their 90s, all still alive. So international law keeps you fit and alive, so go for it. And so he was of this generation of international lawyers who came to age in the 50s, 60s, when independence and decolonization was a booming business, and in fact they are the people who conceptualize the rights of these countries. So even though as an elite, despite the fact that he was a minority member in Egypt, was not necessarily committed to populist democracy, coming from a developing country and being part of this generation of international lawyers aiming for the democratization of international relations. For him it was very, very important. He was one of the key intellectual architects of Bandung, which is where the non-aligned movement started. So I think this is the context in which he thought about these things. Also, and for many years, he was also an intellectual. So for him, thinking and trying to make sense, and the best sense possible of the unfolding realities was very, very important. And he was a professor for all his life, and it's only later in life, when I think he was in his late 60s, that he got involved in politics. In fact, he was instrumental in having a peace agreement taking place between Egypt and Israel. So, he has this history which led him to be interested in these issues.
something you can extract from that that would help to smooth the path to a universalization of some of these ideas?
Well, I think the ability of the practice of reflexivity. I mean, I think, once I began to spend time in the non-West, I mean, besides Europe and the US, the extent of my non-Western experience was in Latin America, because I studied as a Latin Americanist. But Latin America is a bit an ambiguous non-Western continent, because it's an in-between, the southern continent and the West and so on. And so once I spent time in Asia, I realized that, righteousness, which is self-righteousness, is not good. So the goal is to pursue and try to identify intellectually and then pursue politically or practically what is right, while thinking about this right in a very self-reflective fashion. So that's one of the things that I got out of spending time in Asia, and that's one of the things that I got out of having spent time in Asia, got out of working for Boutros. So there is no point to try to pursue intellectually and practically what is right if it is not done in a reflexive and self-aware fashion. And very often, you see, and that's, I think, the challenge for Western intellectuals, is that very often they have no curiosity for intellectual matters, for cultural matters beyond the West. I mean, most of the people who in the West are theorizing the global, first of all, they only speak one language, there's English very often, and also they haven't really made the effort of spending time beyond the West as a way to learn from the non-West, so that the intellectual categories could be revisited and perhaps changed. And I think that the lack of curiosity and the feeling that they have nothing to learn from the other side, I think is a major, major intellectual but also human problem. And so that's, and in a way, you see the elites from developing countries do not have this problem, because themselves, as a way to become actor in the first world, they have to travel a variety of intellectual and social and cultural worlds. In the process, they give themselves an edge that very often top intellectuals in the West don't have. This is very, very important, and therefore very often non-Western elites are bicultural, tricultural, bilingual, trilingual, and so on and so on. And as long as they are not committed to the status quo back home, which is often the case, I think they have great tools that we don't have, because precisely we tend to be monocultural, monolingual, and all these things. So how do we deprovincialize Western global intellectual elites? I think this is both an intellectual agenda, but also an institutional agenda for universities. How do we train the next generation differently? How do we train the people in charge? How do we, while being working, how do we retrain ourselves so that we're not going to be able to reproduce these limitations and pathologies? And that's, I think, the value and the importance of the programs like this one, if we succeed. Because it should be the site for these things to happen intellectually, I think. I don't know. What do you think?
I think we should simply impose on global studies students now the need to master at least 2 or 3 non-Western languages.
I think you're right. No, I think you're right, but also